Hey, deserving listeners, it's time to continue watching the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. I'm going back to the beginning. I already did the forensic psychologist, Dr. Curry reaction.
That's because, as the evidence will show, and you will hear, 2 years earlier, on May 27th, 2016, Ms. Heard had publicly accused Johnny Depp, her husband at the time, of domestic abuse.
Right, so this is what the trial is about. If you don't know, Amber Heard published a piece in the Washington Post that claimed that she was the victim of intimate partner violence and didn't name any names, but everyone knew it was about Johnny Depp. So Johnny Depp feels as though his career was damaged, and so he's suing Amber Heard for $50 million in career damages.
You will learn during the trial that Ms. Heard's actions were prompted by Mr. Depp's request for a divorce. He wanted out, which drove her to make up a story that was, at first, designed to keep him. And then, when he made it clear that finally, after all he had endured, he was done, was designed to recast herself as an abuse survivor.
They are saying, no, in fact, Johnny Depp was not violent and did not abuse Amber. But in fact, Johnny Depp wanted to leave the relationship and was telling Amber Heard this. And then, according to the lawyer right now, Amber Heard wanted to retain the relationship with Johnny Depp and made up lies or something along the lines of violence or chaos or conflict. Then when Johnny Depp said, that's not going to work on me, no, we're really done, then Amber Heard started to spread lies about him. I, of course, have no idea about Amber Heard, but if someone did suffer from significant borderline and histrionic and they were going through a breakup, of course, not everyone with those diagnoses would act this way. At first, the breakup or the signals of losing their partner would be devastating to them. You know, you've heard me talk about borderline before. I won't go over it again, but essentially it's abandonment and rejection trauma and betrayal trauma from the past. And then when that's triggered, even by the slightest of things, there's massive hurt and then massive anger. When there's real rejection, then you can imagine the amount of pain that someone goes through who has those kinds of traumas. Borderline personality disorder. Histrionic is very similar. The traumas are different. It's lack of abandonment trauma, or lack of attention trauma, essentially. But it's a similar premise that it's based on rejection, abandonment. It's sort of abandonment because you're not good enough to garner attention, sort of a thing. Anyway, so then the massive amount of pain, enormous crying, enormous depression, enormous anxiety, falling into the abyss, total emptiness, maybe even engaging in destructive behaviors, non-suicidal self-injury, drinking as a way of trying to cope. And when that didn't work, maybe on the other side of that initial phase, then the individual might be seething with anger because of the hurt. You know, we all go through this, right? When we get dumped, we're hurt and then we get angry. But for the borderline histrionic individual, they're going to be hurt times 10 and angry times 10 as a result of being hurt. People characterize borderline people as being angry, but that is an oversimplification. It's more accurate to say that they're very, very hurt, and all of us will transform our hurt into anger because we see it as less weak. So the individual would be very, very angry and might hold a grudge. And again, all of us do this to some extent. If the breakup was big enough, we might block them in retribution on Instagram, or we might spread rumors about them, or write nasty things in their journal. Or when we're talking to our mutual friends, you'd be like, well, let me tell you what she did. You know, those are things that we know might hurt the other person, and it's a natural impulse. We want to avoid that as much as we can because we usually will regret that later, and it's potentially immoral to act on those impulses of revenge. But for the borderline histrionic individual, that's all times 10. That very normal impulse is times 10, and it lasts longer, and it becomes much more likely that the individual will engage in those behaviors, and they might even make up a story, particularly if they're histrionic, because they're used to making up stories. When they do feel rejected, they tend to over-seek attention in self-destructive ways, and you could see someone making up a story like that their partner was abusive, and if they're famous and they can publish something in the Washington Post, then it'll feel just. It'll feel like, well, he hurt me, and it feels like it was, because that's the other thing, is that for the borderline histrionic individual, when you break up with them or do something that is hurtful to them, it feels 10 times worse, and the way in which they narrativize it will be different. Instead of it being like, well, he's a jerk face because he didn't see the real me, or he's a jerk face because he didn't give us a chance. You know, these are kind of common things that people will say when they're angry and hurt. But to the borderline histrionic person, they might literally think something like, the amount of hurt I'm feeling means that he abused me. That notion of like, I feel abused. And if you grew up with a lot of abuse, of course, it's going to be triggered in that moment, and all those feelings and associations will come up. And so it could feel abusive. And then you start thinking, well, there was that one time when he did this and that. And you're not lying necessarily. You might be, but you might not be. It might just be the way that it feels right. And then it starts to all kind of, slot into the narrative of abuse, even when the abuse didn't happen, or it was extremely minor, questionable as to whether or not it was abuse. And you publish it, and it feels satisfying because you're getting back at someone. We do this. When we're hurt, we unfortunately will have an impulse to make the other person hurt as much as we do. It's really a unfortunate human impulse that causes a lot of problems, not only interpersonally, but also between nations and 1,000-year conflicts between different groups of people. It's really awful. But anyway, so you times that by 10, and it's just like, I'm going to get him back. Even if in the back of your mind you're thinking, well, I'm kind of stretching the truth a little bit, but it's just because look what they did to me. They devastated me. He tricked me. He never loved me, and he gaslit me, and he loved bombed me. These kinds of tag phrases that you'll get from the internet to justify how you feel. Not that love bombing isn't real or gaslighting isn't real. It is. But again, I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm just saying what I could see happening that could have happened. And of course, we're going to hear from Amber Heard's lawyer in a second. But anyway, so then it feels good, but it's only temporary, the attention. And then you step into this world of victim advocates for domestic violence, intimate partner violence, intimate partner aggression. And legitimately, when a famous person steps forward coming out as a victim, then we want to rush to their aid. We want to rush to support them and praise them if it's legit. And we want to support them. And we might even want to hold them up as the poster child of the strong person who steps forward and says, I'm not going to stand for this anymore. And there's a lot of people that will get behind you online, at rallies, this sort of thing. And it might be like a continual river of attention that is there to help you get through a very, very difficult time after a breakup. And as with all personality disorders, the individual will always shoot themselves in the foot. That's the definition of a personality disorder in a nutshell. It's, in my words, causes problems in your life. And this is something that I think people really need to understand about personality disorders, because often, especially with narcissistic personality disorder, there's this notion that somehow people with narcissism get away with it, and they typically do not. People with narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic, borderline, because of their distorted view of the world and because of their massive amount of emotional triggering and their behaviors from that triggering and their inability to have insight on what's happening, their lives are typically train wrecks, and they will drive their own careers into the ground, their own relationships into the ground, their own lives into the ground. And so for this hypothetical borderline histrionic individual, you could see that is happening, because eventually the person you're accusing will strike back and say, this never happened, especially if they're famous, right? Okay, so that's one hypothetical, and I think that's essentially what the lawyer and Johnny Depp's team is trying to lay out.
With Mr. Depp as the alleged abuser, the evidence will show that 6 days after Mr. Depp requested a divorce, and he did so politely, and 3 days after Ms. Heard's lawyer threatened Mr. Depp with claims of abuse if he did not agree to her financial demands, Ms. Heard arrived at the courthouse in Los Angeles, California, to file for a restraining order.
Interesting. So I think what they are laying out here and potentially going to find evidence for was that Johnny Depp went to Amber Heard, said, I want to break up. then I want a divorce. And then 3 days later, Amber Heard's lawyer reached out to Johnny Depp and said, or someone reached out to Johnny Depp and said, I'm going to make it public that you abused me unless you agree to paying me more money upon divorce. Which, if that's true, it's not a good look. But, divorces can get real messy. Then, after he said, no, I don't want to come back or whatever, then that's when the restraining order was taken out as some sort of escalation, according to the legal team of Johnny Depp, of trying to fake that she is in danger or something. Now, another story that could have happened, and I'm guessing we're going to hear evidence from Amber Heard's team, is that abuse did happen the whole time. And when he broke up with her, she decided, well, there's no sense in hiding this anymore because he's leaving me. And so I might as well just actually start protecting myself with a protective order. Frankly, I've been through a lot, so I want more money. Maybe there's a sympathetic storyline. Definitely, that's possible. And I'll tell you, as a therapist who has worked with couples in this situation and families, and occasionally would go to court for this sort of thing, it's so hard to know who's right and who's wrong in these situations. I've been with couples where I'll hear reports from them individually. I'll meet individually because I don't want them to be scared of telling me things in the presence of the other person. And I'll hear stories and I'll be like, oh, whoa, that sounds pretty awful about the other person. And I'll hear the other story like, whoa, that sounds pretty awful. But wait, one of you might be lying, or both lying, or you're both right. Or it gets hard. And as a therapist, it's not my job to figure out what happened. I'm not an investigator or a jury. I tell you all this because I think in society, we watch a story like this and want to immediately come to a conclusion. Well, who am I supposed to feel bad for? And who am I supposed to be angry at? Am I supposed to be angry at both of them? And if I'm listening to this person, are they the victim or are they the jerk face? I don't know. I can't tell. And it's upsetting. We as humans don't like that kind of ambiguity.
Ms. Heard, the evidence will show that Ms. Heard showed up with a mark on her face that mysteriously appeared 6 days after she last saw Mr. Depp. And 6 days before, she publicly filed a request for a domestic violence restraining order.
Wow. So if that's true, that's awful. If they are making this up, that's awful. Someone's awful about this. The lawyer is saying that Amber Heard, upon asking for the restraining order, produced a wound on her face, fake wound that did not exist. If that's true, wow. Now, I will say that I have heard situations where legit victims will know or suspect that the justice system or society or others won't believe them. And so they feel like they have to manufacture evidence because they're actually going through something and they don't have any hard evidence. You can be physically abused and not have any physical signs. So I'm just throwing stuff out there.
The evidence will show that her publicist and the paparazzi were there at the courthouse to document the event, to make sure that Johnny Depp's name was forever associated with the image of an innocent, battered woman.
So the way he's spinning it is that she faked it. She is trying to get attention. It's vindictive. I could see a legit victim who wants to come out public that they're a victim, to advocate for other victims, to have your own healing around this sort of thing. Sometimes, not everyone, when they are victims of various different abuse, it can be healing and provide some level of closure when we make it public or when we go to the police or that sort of thing. So I'm not swayed by that detail, let's just put it that way.
It was a jolt. It was a shocking story, splashed across front pages across the country. No one had ever, in 5 decades, accused Johnny Depp of being violent with a woman.
Okay, so that would be interesting. It doesn't mean that Johnny Depp wasn't abusive to Amber Heard, but if there were no prior allegations publicly, one, you can abuse someone for the very first time when you're 45 years. I don't know how. Well, he's older than me, so he must be in his 50s. I think he's almost 60, actually. And also, he could have been abusive to previous relationships, and those people just haven't come forward. We absolutely know that that happens.
Those are the crucial days between the alleged incident and the day she walked into court with her lawyer and got an ex parte order. And those witnesses will testify that they saw her without any marks, any signs of injury on her face.
Just a little check-in on this, and some of you probably have been victims of this. There is a long history in our society of people being abused of various genders, going to the police and being denied justice. There's a lot of people who have been victimized by abuse of various different kinds, and of those people, when they watch this trial or hear about the story, it could trigger people. It could trigger you. Given your own healing and your own anger and hurt and fear, when you're watching this, say you were a legit abuse victim, you went to the police, they denied you, they told you that your story was inconsistent and you need to go home or whatever. When you watch this could cause you to have all those memories come back. And of course, you want to get therapy, because therapy definitely can help with that. It's one of the best things therapy is for. But when you're watching, it could feel like it's happening all over again, because there are signs that might be happening. And on the other side, you might have been accused of a crime, maybe even intimate partner violence, when you never did such a thing. And you might watch this and be triggered around that as well. And when we watch this, it's natural to get triggered along those lines, but if we're not checking in with ourselves, it's going to take a toll. And also, we might end up getting in fights with people online because we're actually trying to fight a fight from our past and not necessarily this fight.
And you will hear from multiple witnesses, including Brandon Patterson, who is the manager of the Eastern Columbia building.
By the way, just want to say this, that research shows this, and certainly anecdotally, this is my experience, that there are many, many more people in the position of being denied justice when they are legit abuse victims. Many more of those people in that category than there are of people who were falsely accused of a crime like that. It does happen sometimes, but it's pretty rare. The reason why I say that is I don't want to make it seem like this is a both sides issue.
At Ms. Heard's face. Now let's just stop there. This is a surveillance video you will hear about where the sister of the alleged victim threw a fake punch at her sister, which allegedly occurred, this incident, only a couple of days earlier. Ms. Heard acting out being punched, responding to the fake punch, and the two laughing about it. So you have the alleged victim.
Okay, so I think what the lawyer is trying to lay out is, so apparently there's a surveillance video, meaning that Amber Heard and her sister didn't know they were being filmed, presumably, and the sister is doing a fake punch, and then Amber Heard is acting like she's getting hit, and then they're laughing about it. So what could that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. What I think they're trying to say is the way they were seemingly behind the scenes talking about this whole thing doesn't seem to exhibit the somber, sad, angry, hurt, afraid feeling that a victim would be going through. That a sister of Amber Heard's would never joke about that, and certainly you wouldn't think it was funny if you were in the midst of this kind of legitimate abusive situation, especially when you're becoming public.
And the sister laughing about a fake punch. And you will have to decide for yourself, or we ask that you please decide for yourself. Would anyone ever joke about that if there had been actual abuse? Much less ask yourself, would a sister ever joke with an alleged victim about being punched?
This is a pet peeve of mine, that after a crime is allegedly to have occurred, there's this scrutiny on how the alleged victims will react emotionally or behaviorally as a way of trying to gauge whether or not the crime occurred. Like when Linda Chamberlain in Australia, and I've talked about this before, the dingo ate my baby or took my baby. She was changing an infant's diapers, turned around, and when she turned back, and they were at a campsite, turned back, and there was literally a dingo running off into the darkness, into the wilderness with her baby. She runs off. It's pitch black. She can't find it, and then she just starts screaming, "A dingo ate my, it took my baby. A dingo." There's this whole search for the baby, and then because afterwards the Linda Chamberlain did not exhibit, and this is weeks, months later, because to crowds of people watching her on TV, that she didn't exhibit what they thought would be the appropriate amount of grief. They concluded she was guilty, and that whole thing heavily swayed the jury, and she was convicted, and then years later was exonerated when other evidence came out that a dingo did in fact carry off the baby and did in fact eat the baby, tragically. So it's this really horrible story. Another story that I've reviewed quite extensively is the Amanda Knox case in Italy. If you're familiar with that case, her roommate had been murdered. They didn't know who did it, but Amanda Knox and her boyfriend right afterwards were consoling each other and also making out on camera, like just off from the crime scene. When people looked at that, they thought, oh, she must be guilty. And it's ridiculous. It doesn't just extend to crimes, it extends to just more mundane things, like when you go through a breakup or a divorce or something, and say you start dating 6 months later, people will think that you're not properly grieving. Or if a very important loved one dies in your life, and the next day you hear a joke and you laugh, the individual will feel like there's something wrong with them. Why am I laughing at that joke? I should be grieving. And research shows that there are various different reactions after an event like that. So when you go through abuse, and I think her claim is she was being abused regularly throughout the relationship, the divorce is now happening, and say you go out with your sister, have a couple drinks, and you joke around, and maybe you saw something. The fact that we have this security camera of them joking around about it, it has that flavor to it for me of this, well, surely she must be guilty, because who in the world would ever do that? And I'm here to tell you that the way people react to difficulties is varied, and you can't look at a behavior and say, oh, that means they're guilty.
But his trying to leave enraged Miss Heard. She would resort to physical violence, throwing things at him, hitting him. She would tell him he was a coward. She would tell him he wasn't man enough because he wouldn't stay and fight with her.
The other lawyer of Johnny Depp is telling the narrative that I think they're going to try to prove or demonstrate that in reality, Amber Heard was the abusive one, and she was, in this instance, abusive when Johnny Depp was trying to leave and trying to break up with her or something. And I don't know about Amber Heard, of course, but I have treated people like this before who, and I've been talking about borderline and histrionic, but we don't even necessarily have to talk about personality disorders. We can just talk about people who have traumas or extreme reactivity to being rejected. And when they're being rejected and they sense they're going to lose emotional and physical proximity to their partner, they will do a lot of things to try to retain that relationship. An analogy is to children, that when you drop your kid off at daycare at the age of 2 or 3, if they don't want you to leave, they don't want to go to daycare, they're afraid. At first they might cry because they're sad. And they also kind of know that tears and crying will sometimes warm your heart as a parent and get you to relent on something. It's not manipulative. It could be, but it's just a normal expression. Let's say that doesn't work. Then the kid might do something else, like get violent even. Not all kids, of course, but some. My mom had a daycare in my house throughout my childhood and teenage years, and I saw a lot of this sort of thing. I learned a lot about humans and early childhood development and psychology. So when we see that in a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, we see that as, well, you're young and that's what you're going to do. It might be distressful for you as a parent, but you just think, well, they'll get over it, and they usually do, hopefully, especially if you've raised them well enough and they have a secure attachment with you. They're not going to like seeing you go, but they'll adjust and they'll hold you in their heart while you're gone. And they want you to come back soon, but for people who have been abused or mistreated in some way, that they still retain that impulse. The goal is they're trying to retain the relationship. And honestly, everyone has this tendency, whether or not they engage in it or not, it depends. But the borderline histrionic individual has an exaggerated version of this. If Amber Heard has borderline and histrionic, if she lied, if she made up the abuse or greatly exaggerated it, for individuals like that, and you hook them up to a lie detector test, if one existed, it doesn't exist, but if one existed, they might pass because they believe it to be true. I'll tell you a story about a client, and I always change details to mask identities, but I had a client who we had a tense moment in a session. She suffered from borderline personality. It was couples therapy, and it was the wife, and the wife and I had kind of a tense moment, and the session didn't end very well. And I thought, well, I'll see them next week and we'll talk about it. That's always the thing about therapy. You always have the next session and you can talk about it, and maybe I could apologize because sometimes I don't say the right thing, or I'm triggered myself or something, and that can be a really reparative moment for people with borderline, a therapist that actually takes responsibility and apologizes. Anyway, it's an opportunity, but they canceled the next appointment. They canceled the next few appointments, and I thought, oh no, there must have been a rupture there that was bigger than I detected. I knew there was something. I detected a little rupture, but it looks like she doesn't want to ever come back because of the rupture. So I actually called them, we talked about it, and in fact, I found out there was a rupture, and I said, well, if you'd like to come back and we could talk about it, I'd love to do that. And if I've done anything wrong, then I'm absolutely up for taking responsibility for that. And so she tentatively agreed. The husband was all for it. They came in, and I discovered that the wife believes that I told her something along the lines of that she was a piece of crap or something. Like, I can't even say the words because I don't want to get flagged on YouTube, but it was some horrible thing that she thought that I said. And I said, oh, no, I didn't say that. And I thought it would be a simple misunderstanding. And she would quickly say, oh, well, maybe you said this, or, I thought we would enter into a conversation, but she doubled down. She said, no. I heard you more than once say da-da-da-da. And I was like, okay, I'm sorry you heard that, but one, I would never say that to you. I would never say it to any client. 3, I would never think that about a client. 4, I've never thought that about a client. Like, there's just no way that I said that. And the husband said, see, he didn't say that. I knew, I didn't hear him say that, and I didn't think he said that. So I think you don't remember it right. So they had been fighting about it, apparently. And I thought, well, that makes sense. I mean, if that's what she thought I said, then it makes sense that you would terminate with me. If a therapist said that to me, I would terminate with them. I talked with her a long time about it, and she, in the end, conceded that it might not have happened, but she was still, I think, mostly convinced that it had happened. But this is what borderline and histrionic will do to the individual, is the feelings overwhelm the ability to perceive reality correctly. So not only as it's happening, and all of us have this. If you're in a bad mood, for example, well, I'll just tell me, when I'm in a bad mood and my physiology is all off and I'm tired and cranky and my dogs bark, I go ballistic. Like, it is a shot through my nervous system. If I'm in a good mood and I hear my dogs barking, I'm like, it just registers as like, oh, my dogs are barking. Maybe I should go out and deal with it. So we all have that. When we're in a mood, we see the world differently. Also, when we're in a mood, we remember things differently. When you are, say, hurt in a fight with your partner, the fight just happened like an hour ago, and you remember that your partner is to blame and you're not to blame, and so that's the memories have already been encoded, but the retrieval of the memories is heavily laced or affected by the mood you're in and the perspective you're having at the time. Fast forward a week later, hopefully you can look back and say, well, actually, I think I was mostly to blame for that, but she was kind of to blame for that. So our mood and our emotional state greatly affects what we perceive, what we encode, and what we remember. So you times that by 10 for the borderline histrionic individual, and that person went through a lot of actual verbal abuse growing up anyway, then because it feels like I said, you're a piece of crap, then it becomes that I did say that. And this is what we call lack of differentiation in the family systems theory, natural systems theory, that the fusion between your intellect and your emotions. I probably said something like, you have issues, or something like that. Like, hey, you have issues, I have issues, we all have issues. That's something that I try to emphasize sometimes. It's like, you're in therapy because you have issues, but I have issues too. So I'm saying you got issues, but I'm not saying it's weird. I'm saying everyone has issues, but you have issues. So let's talk about it, right? I probably said something like that, but it felt like I was saying she was a piece of crap, because for those with histrionic and borderline, they're extremely sensitive to criticism, typically, because criticism was usually associated in their childhood with absolute rejection and abandonment and betrayal and abuse, potentially. So when I criticized, it felt very, very hurtful, and it felt like I was saying something like, you're a piece of crap, and that is what is remembered. That might have even been how it was encoded. And this is why we call it borderline, if you're interested, and why we even call it. You might be like, why do we call it borderline? Well, because when the personality disorder was first being studied and recognized in the early 20th century, they found that these individuals, particularly at the severe end of the spectrum, seemed schizophrenic, psychotic, delusional. They believed things that weren't true. And the clinician, the psychoanalyst typically, would notice that and say, okay, they're delusional, schizophrenic, or some sort of psychotic disorder. But then as they started to look into it and treat this person longer, they went, oh, well, they're only delusional about interpersonal things. They're not delusional. If someone has schizophrenia, they think, a common persecutory delusion is like the CIA is reading their thoughts or something. Well, that's not interpersonal. That's like a government agency that you literally have never interacted with, potentially. But with borderline histrionic individuals, they will have delusions, so to speak, of relationships, maybe even of what the therapist had said or their spouse had said or things that had happened. So what they labeled it was they're borderline psychotic. So they're not quite psychotic because they don't have that full-blown schizophrenia that we see commonly in those individuals. They're borderline psychotic. That's important because for borderline histrionic people, they could literally believe something that never happened and really, really believe it did and pass a lie detector test with flying colors because in their heart and in their mind, those things happened because that's how it felt to them. That might be happening here. Of course, I have no idea. When Amber Heard comes forward, again, just hypothetically, if we're going to go with this narrative, then Amber Heard could go to the Washington Post and believe that all these things happened, believe that she was a victim of abuse, even remember events that never happened or not remember events that did happen. I don't know if that's what is happening, but it does present a kind of scary scenario for all of us, right?
You will see that Miss Heard equated anger and violence with passion. She would apologize with poetic excuses, as if the violence just proved how fierce and overwhelming her love for him was. And you're going to hear that when Miss Heard got violent, Mr. Depp would just retreat, just as he did with his mother. He would try to leave.
Yeah, I didn't show that part. The lawyer was laying out for Johnny Depp as he was growing up with an abusive mother that he learned to retreat, to get away, to appease, and then get away. And they're trying to lay out a scenario that was repeated with Amber Heard. Does that help the story? I mean, I guess it does, right? But if Johnny Depp did go through that as a child, that could even lend itself to conclusions or speculation that he distorted Amber Heard because of what happened to him in his past. You know what I mean?
To get away from her. In her words, Miss Heard's words, he would split. Mr. Depp would often retreat into bathrooms, lock the doors, wait out Miss Heard's aggression. But his leaving just provoked her more.
All right, so they're laying out a pattern in which there was a lot of conflict between Amber and Johnny, and that Amber Heard would get aggressive verbally maybe physically, and Johnny Depp would retreat often to the bathroom, lock the door, and wait it out, wait for her to calm down. So if that's true, and the allegations against Johnny Depp are either untrue or greatly exaggerated, then yikes.
You will hear from Mr. Depp's security people, like Sean Bett, about how they often had to remove Mr. Depp from scenes with Miss Heard screaming at him, chasing him, trying to keep him from leaving.
All right, so they have witness accounts that people saw Amber Heard screaming at him, chasing him, refusing to let him escape to his bathroom or whatever.
You're going to hear evidence that when Mr. Depp and Miss Heard traveled together, his team routinely had to book an extra room for him so that he had somewhere to go when Miss Heard became enraged. You'll hear from other witnesses, including Mr. Depp and Miss Heard's marriage counselor. Her name is Dr. Laurel Anderson, who perceived Miss Heard as the aggressor in the relationship. Miss Heard as the aggressor in the relationship.
Well, if that's true, then that is interesting. So the lawyer is saying that two couple counselors will testify that their opinion, of course they can't know, but you do get a sense of that in couple therapy. Contrary to what I was saying earlier, that it's hard to tell sometimes, but I'll get a pretty good sense of who is the one who escalates, who is the one who gets rageful. If the couple therapists are willing to attest to that, well, that'll say a lot, honestly. All right, well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.